Indigenous people's use of biological resources in the overall approach we take to trying to look after biodiversity has to be protected. So that means in marine parks, and they get established to protect biodiversity, somewhere in there they've got to be thinking about, well, how do we keep the protection but also allow the sustainable use stuff to go on. It's a very hard one for governments to deal with. Mind you, it's only just now come onto the dinner table. We're going to talk a little bit about that. There are a couple of other articles that talk about access to benefit sharing and what's come out of that in terms of the Nagoya Protocol, which is very strong on Indigenous rights in terms of biodiversity, but we're not going to go on to that. We're going to focus on this Article 10C. And I don't quite have the history correct in my mind, and John might help me here as we go along, but this has come up from COP10 now that there needs to be work done on it. Is that right, John? Where's it, that sort of, at the Nagoya COP10?
At COP10 in 2010, the governments agreed to adopt a plan to implement and respect rights to customary use of biodiversity plants and animals.
In other words, unpack 10C in a meaningful way for governments to be able to go and do this kind of business. So to do that, they actually handed it over to the Secretariat. I didn't mention the Secretariat within the convention with John White, and it was their job to facilitate the development of ideas from Indigenous communities and other players on how we might do that. They held an expert a working group in Montreal last year, and that was a lot of Indigenous people from what's known as the International Indigenous Biodiversity Forum, and that's a structure, a sort of quasi structure now that's set up that we feed into the working group. And there were people from that as well as other people came to that expert working group, and then we threw up a whole heap of ideas about how we think 10C should be addressed, including things about commercial rights and all that sort of thing. A paper came out of that which was then handed on to the working group, which then sat down with it, the government started fiddling around with it a little bit, because some of our ideas might have been a bit too out there for people. And because they had to say, from that, a paper was then developed, which was then sent to the COP in India last year. And at that COP in India, we had to argue about what components of that plan should we prioritise and should we start working on. And we were quite successful. I thought, even though we didn't get everything, we did manage to get our foot in the door to get something started. And so we're now at that stage. And shall I hand it over to you, John, to sort of pick it up?
So, our last COP, they agreed on a plan of action for customary sustainable use. A lot of the input in our partners, our Indigenous community partners, come from a large NGO called the Forest Peoples Program, and they have established a 10C network, which is a network of Indigenous peoples and local communities who are working on rights to customary use. How does this work? Okay. Well,
you want to go back to the beginning? Or?
Oh, okay, I don't know where I'm going. Let's see. Okay. The main thing I want to get to is I want to pass on to some of our community people here to talk about what they're doing. Okay. This is last year. Where was I? In Hyderabad in India in October. The governing body, which is attended by 14,000 people, every government in the world, including governments such as the US who come as observers, they agreed to develop a plan of action on customary use. Because it's fine to have an article, but you actually need a plan of action to take action towards achieving these rights. So they agreed, and of course we know customary use is the classroom for traditional knowledge. Traditional knowledge really is knowledge, innovations and practices. It's not just things we did in the past. And sometimes we use the word traditional knowledge, people think that it means just the past. But the full term actually is knowledge, innovations and practices. And how is it passed on? By people intergenerationally, by practicing this on the ground through customary sustainable use. So if you're going to promote traditional knowledge, you have to encourage customary sustainable use. Well, and I even have some problems with the word customary because you don't want to be limited to things that were done in the past. We're also developing. We also have a right to develop this in many international conventions. So of course this is how TK and customary use are linked. Anyway, the latest is that almost every government in the world has committed to incorporate customary sustainable use into programs and policies. promote and strengthen community-based initiatives that support and strengthen customary sustainable use, and to identify, encourage and promote best practices, including the use and the development of community protocols and the recognition of community conservation areas. Community protocols is a term that's been popular in Africa. In Asia, people talk about processes for prior and informed consent. Some groups talk about recognition of customary law. So it's kind of an umbrella term for the recognition of all of these things. Some communities are busily developing community protocols so that outsiders know how to approach and work with them. And in a community protocol, if you agree to share and commercialise some of your knowledge, you can embed obligations in the contract so that outsiders are aware of obligations arising from customary law without actually having to reveal everything that customary law is. But you can reveal the obligations so that outsiders know this. When it comes to access to traditional knowledge, we're encouraging that access is based on prior and informed consent, that if you want to share some knowledge for commercial purposes, you enter into mutually agreed terms, and the result is that there's equitable sharing of benefits as a result of that. So we use the word MAT, mutually agreed terms, FPIC, of course. When you follow the CBD, you become an expert in the acronyms that go with the CBD. Governments are now going about implementing this through revising their national biodiversity strategies. And this is very important because this is how it's going to be implemented on the ground. We've set ourselves 20 OHCHR targets. They're called OHCHR targets because they were agreed on in Japan, and a revised strategic plan to try and stop the loss of biodiversity by 2020. We had a previous plan by 2010. It all failed miserably, although we made some advances in some areas. But the fact is the world is losing biodiversity fast. And if we don't address it within our generation, there may be very little left for future generations. And we talk about climate change. Climate change is a big factor and it's accelerating everything, but there's lots of other problems that biodiversity was facing before climate change came along. Okay, so this is what governments have been asked to do. How are we measuring this? Indigenous peoples, through the processes that we work, we're looking at indicators, and government said they wanted a small number of indicators, so finally they agreed on 3. Because we need indicators to know if our work is actually making a difference. So Indigenous people suggested, and governments accepted, that the indicators would be status and trends in traditional languages, status and trends in traditional occupations, livelihoods, and status and trends in land tenure and land use, changes in land use. So these are, Indigenous people suggested these because they thought if we're limited to 2 or 3, these would provide a holistic view of the health of traditional knowledge. So now our job is, of course, to try and operationalise these and collect statistics on them. And at that point, I think I'm going to hand over now. Okay, this is everything we're going to talk about in October, but we don't have time to do that in 30 minutes. But as you can see in red, we're looking at customary sustainable use as a major component of work, taking us up to 2020. Now, I might introduce some of our friends here. I might start with Canella, who comes from the government of Sweden, but she's been a great support to Indigenous peoples, and they've also been helping Indigenous peoples establish community-based monitoring systems and information systems to collect this information to see what are the status and trends in these things. We have Grace and Florence, and who else is here? Actually, I'll let you identify yourselves. Maybe we can go around. We have Prasad from Thailand. Who else is here? Gladman? Yeah. Gladman's here. Simon? But I'll just let them introduce themselves.
John, did you just want to quickly put up what's going to be mentioned at the ad hoc working group in October so that people can see what elements have actually been picked out for 10C to be worked on?
Oh, okay. No, this is these things. Governments have to incorporate the customary sustainable into their national biodiversity strategies. Also, we have to identify and encourage and promote best practices in sustainable use of biodiversity, and also develop community protocols or processes for prior and informed consent, processes to recognise obligations arising from customary laws, and also recognised community conservation areas. The governments have undertaken, when it comes to conservation areas, to have 17% terrestrial land and inland waters by 2020, and 11% marine protected areas. And governments are increasingly interested in what Indigenous peoples can contribute to the recognition of Indigenous community conservation areas, which I don't need to tell Aboriginal Australia and the Torres Strait Islanders is a big deal for us here in Australia. But different Indigenous people have different experiences with this. Now, I'll hand over to some of our friends.
I'm Grace Malawag from the Tubtuba Foundation. This is the Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy Research and Education. We have a Philippine network of traditional knowledge holders, and then we also have this global network on community-based monitoring information systems, and we are trying to come up with common aggregated data to be provided to our own governments, to be included in the indicators report for on traditional knowledge, on traditional livelihoods, occupations, language, and also land use, tenure, and land use changes.
Let's go around the front row. Lawrence is going to skip. Sharina? No.
Yeah.
Well, 10 minutes. Okay.
I'm Kenshi and from Nepal.
From Nepal.
I'm Redman from Zimbabwe. I work with a community-based organization called the Indigenous Association. Maybe just to summarize, the most important thing that we are pushing, especially on TNC, is policy. We are involved as a community to try to lobby for government to include issues that address traditional knowledge and customer sustainable use in the constitution, in the various environmental policies. For those of you who have time to listen to the media, I think Zimbabwe at the moment is developing a new constitution, and I have a copy of the constitution there. We have tried to give a contribution to see if there are issues related to traditional use and access and benefit sharing and local community interest could be kept. We've also influenced the National Environmental Policy for 2009, and that currently has also featured the issue of community conserved areas. There are quite a number of initiatives that we can share in relation to customer sustainable use, but I've just concentrated on the policy-related aspects. Thank you.
Namaste, I'm Kamal from Nepal. I'm actually a biologist, so I'm working with this indigenous people's umbrella organizations in district level and grassroots level. We have more than 400 different various organizations in grassroots levels. So looking about these customary practices related in biodiversity and of course in fresh waters. So we found it is challenging because it is rapidly disappearing of this customary use because the lack of awareness and lack of ownership. So we are talking with these governments to respect, to recognize and protect. Thank you.
I'm Simon Mitambo. I work for a network called African Biodiversity Network. It's a network of organizations and communities, and we work to support communities to revive their customary laws of origin that also help in governance of their areas of ecological and spiritual importance.
Thanks, sir.
I'm Prasad from Thailand, and the Karen groups. In the case of customary use, it is very important. We'll be talking about legal framework, because most of the state use only civil law or the money law. And we have quite several cases on the practice of traditional practice especially the case of the farming. Always we cannot do anything because government never recognizes the customary law. We have one special case, the first time in Thailand, we did a call from the case of the arrest farmers who cultivate rotating farming. That case, inside the judge, they opened to read 5 years some of the research on the rotating farming. We found that it's a cultural practice. They recognize. At the first year we did a call for that. That I think that's very important to recognize the customary use.
I want to apologise also, we've planned to have 75 minutes and then have 30 minutes. But like, if anyone has any questions or comments, just let us know your name, and particularly if the questions focused on a particular presenter. We might just have a quick chat in the next 5 to 10 minutes before we finish.
We will be too late. Sorry.
Okay, I think it's interesting when we talk about customary sustainable use and traditional knowledge. We don't want to be caught in a trap where governments agree that we can only do what we did in the past. So of course the issue of customary use versus customary sustainable use versus sustainable use in general is an issue. Also, we talk about TK, but we're talking about knowledge, innovations and practices. We're not frozen in time. We continue to react and change to things around us. And I think that's particularly important for Indigenous peoples when it comes to local level adaptation to climate change. Thanks, Sam.
Hi, my name's Sam Johnson. I'm from United Nations University Traditional Knowledge Initiative. I guess it's a very short time, but it'd be very useful to know, John, you're preparing for this meeting in October and with this issues on, and there's a, how can we get you the information so that you can bring it into these international meetings? What's your timetable? Because, I know you've got to produce some documentation, and what kind of contributions would you like from the group which would help advance your discussions and help you write the paper?
Very good. Thanks, Sam. Good question. I think my email address is at the end.
Oh, is it?
But what happens is the governing body last October in India made this decision, and then the working group on Article 8J, which meets in Montreal between the 7th and 11th of October, will look at the documentation before it. And my job, we put out an official notification that's circulated to all the governments, to Indigenous peoples and local communities organisations. We have about 700 of them in our database, and all the 7 regions recognised by the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And we collate everything that's sent to us into information documents, then we distill it into working documents that are translated into the 6 UN languages. So then the governments all meet in October and they look at what's before them. It's not a perfect process. I don't have to tell you that Indigenous organisations are overworked and under-resourced, and they're not set up to provide input into international bodies without any funding. So a lot of this is done by individuals who are committed to the issues. People like Stefan and the people that you've got in front of you. The Forest Peoples Program has put in a large submission on customary sustainable use. Some governments send us submissions, some of them play their cards rather close to their chest and don't let their positions out until we get to the meeting. It depends on the different political strategies that they use. But at 8J, it's a very open debate on what draft decisions are sent to the governing body to take the next steps forward to make sure this happens. The working group on 8J is usually attended by about between 500 and 700 participants. I would say a third to a half are Indigenous peoples and local community representatives. And at the working group, we have enhanced participation mechanisms. So the working group is chaired by a government, and an Indigenous chair is elected by the Indigenous caucus. There's a 6-member government bureau, and the Indigenous elect a 7-member Indigenous bureau because there's 7 Indigenous geocultural regions recognised by the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. So the Bureau then, the Government Bureau and the Indigenous Bureau come together to manage the meeting. And if they can't resolve something on the floor of the meeting, it goes to a contact group, which is usually held in a smaller room like this, and they appoint both a government chair and an Indigenous chair. So the working group, actually Indigenous peoples are on a fairly level playing field when it comes to the conversation with governments. This doesn't happen in the governing body, of course. Indigenous peoples do have effective participation there, but it's not on a level playing field with governments. In the governing body, of course, the governments talk first and Indigenous peoples talk after them. And this is usually what happens in the international system. This is why we try and have a full discussion at OHCHR and send draft decisions that Indigenous peoples agree with to the governing body for the governing body to endorse. It's a tough process. I've been there for 10 years. The eighth meeting of the working group is coming up in October. I have about 100,000 words to write, 12 official documents to finish by the end of July. If you have any comments on customary sustainable use, you can email them directly to me, and I'll make sure it makes it into the documents that will be negotiated in October. We also, if you want to actually come to the meeting, actually we can flip back just a minute and I'll wrap up. Different people come from Aboriginal Australia. Neva's been, Stefan's been, Nelsa has come for a while. But we have a voluntary fund set up to facilitate the participation of Indigenous peoples in meetings held under the convention, such as OHCHR. So I'm busy raising money. People have to apply 3 months before the meeting. That's by the 6th of July. And we have a 7-member Indigenous selection committee that selects from the hundreds of applications. Depending on how much money we get, I always try and get at least 20 to 70 people to the meeting. As well as that, the Indigenous caucus themselves are very good at raising money, even better than me. So you can also write to Malia McGregor, who is a young woman, an Indigenous woman from Hawaii, and she's the IIFB coordinator, which is a part-time funded position. Only recently they received some funding for this. She's been doing it voluntarily for many years. And so the Indigenous also have a fundraising campaign and fund Indigenous peoples directly to come to the meeting. So you can either be self-funded, apply to the voluntary fund, or get connected with the Indigenous caucus through Malia and apply through the Indigenous processes. If you want to actually come to OHCHR, OHCHR is held in different countries. If we don't get a country putting up its hand for the costs, we have it in Montreal where the Secretariat is based. Secretariat is about 80 people. Half of them are administrative staff, the other half are professionals with different kinds of backgrounds, scientific, legal, education, and I'm the only Australian there. I'm not the only Indigenous person there. My junior colleague, Viviana Figueroa from Argentina, is an Indigenous woman. So her and I work on these issues of traditional knowledge, customary use, and also trying to make sure Indigenous voices are heard across all the meetings held under the convention. We're subject to the availability of financial resources, so that's what government says. Okay. Thank you, I hope it was an interesting presentation.